Welcome to the Delineation, an astrology show with Cam White.
What's up, everybody? I totally have not fixed that audio, so sorry for the whack intro music. I will get a better one here soon. Welcome back to the Delineation. I believe this is episode 24, and today we are talking about the history of Saturn in Pisces. If I sound a little rushed, one, it's because I already recorded this whole episode, but then when I listened to it back, there was something up with my microphone on my computer, and it was like doubled and reverbed, and it sounded awful. It would have totally annoyed everybody. So here I am recording it again. But this is a really important episode. I have said this plenty of times that by March and April, we're going to see a really big shift in the world. My thoughts about it, I feel like I've been pretty clear, especially if you've been on my Patreon, where I get to talk about things much more openly without having to worry about censorship or getting the wrong idea from people. So most of my patrons know how I feel about all of this, but the reason this episode is so important is because in order to understand, like, astrology is a lot about understanding the past. And if we can look at the past and we can understand what things were happening in the past given a certain transit, it's going to be easier to understand the future. So I will be making a video about Saturn and Pisces, like a regular astrology video. A couple years ago in 2020, I made a video of Saturn and Aquarius. A lot of you actually found me through that video. And I'll be going over the meaning of Saturn and Pisces and the Saturn-Neptune conjunction and what it means for your zodiac sign. But today we're just going to be going into the history of Saturn and Pisces. And this episode, just like I did with my Pluto and Aquarius episode, what I did is I just kind of went through Wikipedia and I highlighted all of the things that I thought were relevant to Saturn and Pisces. There are a few things that I have on here that also, excuse me, I'm kind of getting over a cold that I've had for a little bit. And so I feel a lot better than I did when I originally recorded this, but you might hear me cough or sniffle. So my apologies, but just like my Pluto and Aquarius video where we went over the history, we're going to go over the history of this. But what's easier about Saturn is Saturn transits the same sign every 30 years. So we're going to be going back the past 4 times Saturn has been in Pisces. So there's going to be things that I talk about that aren't necessarily relevant to Saturn and Pisces. I just thought were interesting, but there are going to be a lot of things that we talk about that are very relevant to Saturn in Pisces. And of course, I have to bring into context some of these things. Like, we're going to be talking a lot about the 60s, and there's some context to talk about there, and we'll get into that. But I was really debating how I was going to do the timeline of this, because we're going to talk about the 90s, the 60s, the 30s, and the aughts, the 1900s. And rather than going in linear time, I want to talk about the 60s and then the 90s, and then we're going to talk about the 30s and the 10s. And so just to bring up some distinction here as well, Saturn transits the same sign every 30 years, but every 60 years, Saturn and Jupiter transit the same sign. So, like, for example, when you're 30 years old, you have your Saturn return. Most people know that. But when you're 60 years old, you have both your Saturn return and your Jupiter return. So Saturn's going to go into Pisces, and Jupiter, the ruler of Pisces, will be ingressing into Taurus. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about the last 2 times that happened, which was the 60s and the 1910s, or the 1900s, I should say. So I guess let's go ahead and get started with it. So let's bring up the notes here that I have. So again, I have all these notes here. We're going to first talk about 1964, and we're going to talk about Saturn leaving Aquarius in 1964, because there's a few things that I thought were interesting. Number 1, January 11th. United States Surgeon General Luther Terry reports that smoking may be hazardous to one's health, the first such statement from the U.S. government. I've said this time and time again. One of my major predictions for the Saturn ingress and the Pluto ingress is that the thing that doctors recommended, I shouldn't even say recommended, but that we were all forced to take, it'll be coming out that it wasn't actually all that safe. It wasn't all that well tested, and there's going to be some problems. And you could see the history of that repeating, because I don't know if you guys remember, but doctors, the so-called science experts that are so trustworthy all the time, used to recommend smoking cigarettes to everybody. It used to be promoted through doctors as something healthy to do. And so throughout history, doctors have not always been wrong, but have gotten many, 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 many things wrong. But it's interesting that on January 11th, as Saturn was leaving Aquarius going into Pisces, the United States Surgeon General reports that smoking may be hazardous to one's health as the first such statement from the U.S. government. So there's a little bit more of an indicator there for one of my major predictions that, hey, that thing where we're all mandated to take that was supposed to be healthy and safe actually isn't. And I know a lot of people really hate that I say that, but hey, so far my predictions have been more and more and more right. So anyway, let's keep going. January 28th, the U.S. Air Force jet training aircraft that strays into East Germany is shot down by Soviet fighters near Erfurt. I don't know how to say that. All 3 crewmen are killed. Why I thought this was interesting is another one of my major predictions is World War III is starting. This is not, this whole Ukraine situation is not about supporting the Ukrainians. It is about the military industrial complex siphoning tax dollars from you and I to make more money off of killing people. And what you're going to see over these next 3 years is a major world war breakout. And this has nothing to do with defending the Ukrainians. This has everything to do with the military of the US government wanting to not only fight Russia, but take Russia down in order to spread US imperialism and to take over the financial sector of Europe and Russia. So something that you see a lot during, we'll be talking, and again, the context here is this is the middle of the Cold War. Most people know what the Cold War is, but it was essentially, hey, World War II stopped. We figured out that actually communism is really bad, even though so many in the astrology community love to say that they're communists, even though, it's killed more like hundreds of millions of people. But they like to ignore that one. We were in a Cold War with communism, well, with Russia more specifically, and there was a lot of back and forth. Nothing really happened, but what you're going to see here is a lot of, how do I say this? Like pilots being shot down. Luckily, this didn't strike anything. I mean, also, this was just 2 years before this. I believe in 62, maybe it was 63, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we literally almost got into nuclear war with Russia. So you're going to start seeing some similarities here and some patterns repeat. But anyway, I thought this was interesting, and there's going to be a few more of these things that we talk about. The U.S. Air Force training aircraft that strays into East Germany shot down by Soviet fighters. February 11th, Greeks and Turks begin fighting in Limassol, Cyprus. So this is interesting. I have a patron of mine who's Greek and talks a lot about this. From what I understand, the Greeks and the Turks, fighting each other is like in their blood. Like they just love fighting each other. It's gone out throughout time and history. But what you're seeing right now currently is more escalations between Greece and Turkey, which is also something I'm going to go into. Spoiler alert. Almost like every major earthquake in history happened during Saturn and Pisces. And something that I thought was interesting about the Turkey earthquake that we just had was the US embassy in Turkey issued out a warning just days before that earthquake for Americans to get out. And this was because from what I was reading in the news was that essentially, Turkey is trying to broker a deal between Russia and Ukraine for a peace deal. And Turkey also vetoed Sweden entering NATO. And NATO didn't like that. And so I thought it was interesting that they said, hey, U.S. residents should leave Turkey. And then all of a sudden there was a gigantic earthquake there. Maybe there's no connection, but it's an interesting coincidence to say the least. Also on February 11th, the Republic of China severs diplomatic relations with France because of French recognition of the People's Republic of China. I meant to do a little bit more research on this. I always get confused with the PRC, which is the People's Republic of China, and then there's the People's Liberation Army, and then there's the CCP. But long story short, another thing that you're going to see here is almost every major incident between China and Taiwan happens with Saturn and Pisces. So this is another thing that I've talked about in my I did 2 delineations, one about Pluto and Aquarius, the first one, and another one about Russia and Ukraine and World War III. And that is more than like, for a minute, I was a little bit I was much more like, yeah, that's going to happen. And then after the Taiwan elections, and I've been kind of trying to get into it more, I kind of hesitated to be like, yeah, that's totally going to happen. I had a little bit of reclusiveness about it, or changed my mind a little bit. But after kind of going into the astrology, I think China is going to invade Taiwan. So we see that happening. March 9th. And again, this is Saturn in Aquarius moving into Pisces. We're not in Saturn and Pisces yet. March 9th, New York, and this is 1964. New York Times Co. versus Sullivan. The United States Supreme Court rules that under the First Amendment, speech criticizing political figures cannot be censored. Why I thought this was interesting is, I don't know if how many people know about this, but recently the DOJ just arrested a comedian for spreading false information about elections. I think he was like impersonating Hillary Clinton or something like that. And I think it's interesting that for one, they could just imprison people for, something that their First Amendment rights literally say that they can do. But you see this coming up here again, where speech criticizing political figures cannot be censored. And we're seeing the DOJ take action against someone who has, free speech rights, going against a political figure. So we'll see what's going on with that. Here's where it gets a little bit more Pisces. The London Fisheries Convention, I don't have a date for this one, but the London Fisheries Convention is signed, giving signatories the right of full access to fishing grounds within 12 nautical miles of Western Europe coastline. Interesting that the fish thing comes up. You'll see a few more fish things come up. March 10th, Soviet military forces shoot down an unarmed reconnaissance bomber that had strayed into East Germany. The 3 U.S. flyers parachute to safety. So again, more escalations between the U.S. and Russia. Wonder if we see that repeating at all. Now we actually have Saturn moving into Pisces, and this is really important. So during this time in the 60s, there was 4 main events happening. There was the Cold War, and that was going on since the end of World War II until Russia collapsed in 89 or 90. I forgot what year it is. We had the Vietnam War, which we're going to talk a lot about right now. We had the space race, which is also really interesting because a bunch of space stuff happens with Saturn and Pisces, a bunch of like science things. And I guess you can argue that Saturn or Pisces can be kind of, and I'll talk, and I'll show you what I mean by that. I would like to know your guys' opinions on how you can figure in the Pisces stuff being about like science, because in my opinion, Aquarius is much more science oriented. But well, I'll just go over it, and I want to know your guys' opinions about all this in the comments below. But the fourth thing we had was the civil rights. What was it called? The civil rights movement. Yeah, the civil rights movement. So we'll see a lot of that, and I have some predictions about that too. So we're in 1964. We're in March, and Saturn moves into Pisces. March 27th, Good Friday, the Great Alaskan Earthquake, the second most powerful known and the most powerful earthquake recorded in North America history, at a magnitude of 9.2, strikes South Central Alaska, killing 125 people and inflicting massive damage to the city of Anchorage. So really big earthquake, really big deal, not a small deal whatsoever. Hold on, let me see if I could do something. Sorry, I just want to fix. No, that's not what I want to do. Okay, sorry. I wanted to fix something and it's not working. Okay, anyway. So major earthquake, and we're going to see a lot of that. April 20th, U.S. President Lyndon Johnson in New York and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in Moscow simultaneously announced plans to cut back production of materials for making nuclear weapons. So this is a little glimmer of hope. I wish I could say that I feel the same, but given the current circumstances of the world, and that's the thing, during this time, you do see a lot of nuclear disarmament. You do see a lot of nuclear tensions coming down, which thank God, right? I wish I could sit here and say the same about this current moment and that escalations will go down, but I'm hesitant because I don't see anything that would say that, yeah, we're starting to get a little bit more calmer. But this was good news. Here's a little bit more Pisces for you. April 25th, thieves steal the head of the Little Mermaid statue in Copenhagen, Denmark. Although the attack was attributed to Jorgen Nash, the Danish media blamed the painter Henrik Brun, who never confessed to the crime. So I just thought, fish stuff. Little Mermaid head gets stolen. Funny. May 2nd, Vietnam War. Attack on the USNS Card. An explosion caused by Viet Cong commandos causes carrier USNS Card to sink in the port of Saigon. More tensions in Vietnam, which we'll be going over as we go along. On the same day, some 400 to 1,000 students marched through Times Square, New York, and another 700 in San Francisco in the first major student demonstration against the Vietnam War. Smaller marches also occur in Boston, Seattle, and Madison, Wisconsin. So I really hope to see this. Unfortunately, right now, if you are anti-war, you are painted as a Russian propagandist and a Putin puppet, which is insane to me because something that you see during the Vietnam War is the draft. And we'll be talking a lot more about the draft as we come along here. But I really hope that people change their tune and understand that this is a war. This is a, thing that will involve people like you and me. Like, I'm only 26. There's a war. I will be drafted. And I really hope to see that some of the more liberal and leftists understand that this goes against their politics. And I know some people on the left are against the war, but unfortunately, most of the Democratic, majority is very much pro-war at this moment. They want to fund Ukraine to the absolute brink to where, Russia will. I mean, there's going to be a new war front in Europe in March. That's just how it is. And that's going to escalate. And I hope that the people who pushed this escalation rather than pushing for peace negotiations realize that maybe just arming the Ukrainians to escalate a war between NATO and Russia might have been a bad idea because it's going to involve greater Europe and America. So I hope to see more war protests. I don't think and there is going to be a big war protest in DC on February 19th. I really hope it makes some type of noise. But let's go on. May 4th, here we get to Saturn and Pisces stuff. The United States Congress recognizes bourbon whiskey as a distinctive product of the United States. Pisces, Jupiter is definitely alcohol. But I just thought that this was interesting because, bourbon and whiskey is a really big part of like American heritage and culture. And also it can't be claimed bourbon unless it's actually from, Bourbon County, Tennessee, I believe. So this is just a little bit of interesting Pisces news. May 12th, 12 young men in New York City publicly burned their draft cards to protest the Vietnam War, the first such act of war resistance. Hey, that's looking cool. I like that. I hope to see more anti-war protests. I really do. August 2nd, so we skip a couple months here, and I don't remember. I think Saturn. Oh, no, so Saturn was still in Pisces, okay, because Saturn does go back into Aquarius, which we'll talk about. August 2nd, Vietnam War, the United States destroyer Maddox is attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. Air support from the carrier USS Ticonderoga sinks one gunboat while the other two leave the battle. So something important about the Gulf of Tonkin incident was it was essentially a false flag for us to get involved in Vietnam. And this is really where the vibe changed and war escalated. And given the situation with the UFOs that we were being shot down, sounds a lot like a false flag to me. I believe in aliens to some degree, but I think the idea that the U.S. Air Force can just shoot one down with a rocket, given if this is an alien, these are craft that have been able to bend literally time and space to get here. You think a missile is just going to take them down? I don't think so. We also haven't recovered any of the debris. I'm recording this on Valentine's Day, so maybe that changes by the time that you listen to this. But I kind of see it as much more of a false flag because there's nothing scarier than a UFO and aliens attacking us to usher in more fascist policies. So I really hope we've learned from the COVID incident that not everything the government tells us is true and that we should be questioning what the mainstream media narrative is. And when I say mainstream media, I mean the propaganda arm of the U.S. government, which is their press secretaries and whatever they say, and the military. So I know some people are going to disagree with me on some of that stuff, but history would tell you that maybe you have too much trust in your government. But anyway, August 7th, Vietnam War. The United States Congress passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson broad war powers to deal with North Vietnamese attacks on U.S. forces. Wow, so we expand military control from the president. Interesting. I wonder if that comes up more. Huh. Here's something a little bit lighter, though, and this is actually something I'm really interested in. August 27th, Walt Disney's Mary Poppins has its world premiere in Los Angeles. It will go on to become Disney's biggest moneymaker and winner of 5 Academy Awards, including Best Actress. It is the first Disney film to be nominated for Best Picture. This is really interesting to me because, and I'll be going along with this, Mary Poppins, The Lion King, Toy Story, 3, there's another one too, I forgot what it is, but 3 of Disney's biggest pictures came out with Saturn and Pisces. And why that's interesting to me is, for the most part, I don't really care about Disney. Of course, I grew up on their movies and I love like their older movies. But what's interesting to me is Disney's like, they're getting so political that they're having these up and downs. Like you can argue that they're not doing all that well. And I'm really curious if there's some sort of in my head, I go like like for example, when Saturn was in Pisces in the 90s, Toy Story was released, and we'll talk about that, which was the first computer animated film. So I'm like, are they going to have like their first AI film, like all completely written by a computer and made by a computer? I don't know. Excuse me, but there's something very Pisces about Disney. Well, I should say Disney movies. And there's a lot of this, big Disney hits happening with Saturn and Pisces. And that's the other thing. So many Disney movies are huge hits. So I'm kind of curious about what is different over the next 3 years and what Disney does that creates some type of picture that's really big. And we'll be going into it. All right. So now we're still in 64. Saturn goes back into Pisces for just 1 second. September 11th, in Jacksonville, Florida, during a tour of the United States, John Lennon announces that the Beatles will not play to a segregated audience. This was a big deal. Still had segregation going on during this time, and this is really that Aquarius vibe. Like, I brought this up because the Aquarius vibe really comes back in. It's like, why are we segregated? This is dumb. And I thought that was interesting. The other thing that's interesting is on October 14th through the 15th, Nikita Khrushchev is deposed as leader of the Soviet Union. Leonid Brezhnev and Alexei Kosygin assume power. This is a big deal. I've said this a bunch of times especially on my Patreon, but Putin will not be the president of Russia for that much longer. He will probably die of his illnesses that he has, whatever that is. Probably, I'm thinking 2025. That's just the Saturn Neptune stuff that's going on. And we're going to see a whole new era of Russian politics assume power, which is quite a big deal. I know this is going to sound funny. I don't like Putin. I'm not like pro Putin in any way. But given who he is, given who's coming up next, Putin is a much more rational person. I think as we see the new leaders come up, they're going to be much more hawkish. I think they're going to be much more ready to go, which may not necessarily be a good thing. I don't think it's going to be a good thing at all. So that's a really big deal. We see, during Saturn and Pisces, Nikita Khrushchev was a really big deal in Russian politics, and that changes during the Saturn and Pisces times, or that was back actually when Saturn went into Aquarius, but we're still in 1964. Saturn moves back into Pisces, and the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird makes its first flight at Palmdale, California. This was a huge deal because the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was like the first plane to go at a certain speed and altitude that was kind of untouchable. And so something that you see during this time of Saturn and Pisces is all these tech innovations coming around the line of stealth. So this was a stealth bomber that was a really big deal. I would really have you, if you're interested at all, I used to be so interested in planes. I wanted to be a pilot when I was a kid. You should look up some stuff about the SR-71 Blackbird. It was a really, really, really big deal. So now we're still back in Saturn and Pisces. I don't have any date for this. This was just on the Wikipedia part with no date of 1964. But spring, the first recognition of cosmic microwave background radiation as a detectable phenomenon. This is a big deal. When you start talking about microwave background radiation and understanding space, that discovery is a big deal. And as we go into the 1900s and 1930s, you're going to see other discoveries about space and time and physics that are really fundamental to our understanding of what they are now. Jerome Horwitz synthesizes zidovudine, or AZT, an antiviral drug which will later be used in treating HIV. Some interesting drugs that come out during this time. Farrington Daniels becomes an early advocate of solar energy in his book Direct Use of the Sun's Energy, published by Yale University Press in the United States. This I thought was really interesting because this was so early for the sun, solar energy being used. And now with the whole, green movement using solar panels, I think you're going to see more discrepancy with them. Putting solar panels in the Pacific Northwest is dumb. They don't get enough sunlight, but where do we use them? What is the most appropriate use for them? I just think you're going to see solar energy come up in a little bit of different ways, but I thought this was interesting as kind of like a starting point. This one was just for me. I thought this was funny. Rudy Jernrich designs the original monokini topless swimsuit in the U.S. Pisces has nothing to do with boobies, but I thought, hey, that's cool. Boobs. Anyway, so we get to 1965. So this is another one of my major predictions. In 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. Pretty much immigration. I've actually said this a lot on my astrology report, on all types of other things of the Immigration Act that was passed. So we're going to come back to this in just a second, but the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, Saturn and Pisces. 1994, you see that ratified. It gets extended in some way. And what was the other thing? I'll remember as we go along because I have it written down. But immigration is going to be a really big deal as we move forward throughout the next few years. Who is allowed into the country? What policies that we have to enable that, especially both on the southern border, but also, in my opinion, when you start talking about war in Europe, you're going to have people like, from what I understand, the Ukraine war has been the biggest migration of humans in history. I think it was like 3 million people have fled the country for what's that word? The thing where it's like war's happening, so you leave. I can't remember the name of it. But you're going to see more immigration stuff come up because that's just a Saturn and Pisces thing that you see. And also, I think that's true just for Pluto also going into Aquarius. But let's keep going down. March 2nd, Vietnam War, Operation Rolling Thunder. The United States Air Force, 2nd Air Division, United States Navy, and the South Vietnamese Air Force begins a 3.5-year aerial bombardment campaign against North Vietnam. They also don't mention they bomb Laos and Cambodia to smithereens, but 3.5 years is an interesting timeline because Saturn typically transits a sign every 2.5 to 3 years. So here we go. Big war movement. Rolling Thunder was a really big deal. Here we go. March 7th, Bloody Sunday. Some 200 Alabama state troopers attack 525 civil rights demonstrators in Selma, Alabama, as they attempt to march to the state capital of Montgomery. Why? I'm going to bring up why this is important in just a second, because it's not the next one, but the one after that. The next day on March 8th, so now we're again 1965, Vietnam War, some 3,500 United States Marines arrive in Da Nang, South Vietnam, becoming the first American ground combat troops in Vietnam. So here we go, war. And let me also bring this up too. I think this is an important distinction. During the 60s, this was Saturn and Pisces opposite Pluto and Virgo. And most of you have probably heard of the book. I always point to my library. The book, The Cosmos and Psyche by Richard Tarnas. It is a fucking huge book. It is not a light read. But the Saturn-Pluto conjunctions and oppositions are really, really, really big deals. Let's go over them real quick. Saturn conjoining Pluto, December 2019, COVID hits. Saturn-Pluto opposition, 9/11. That was in 2001. Saturn-Pluto conjunction in the early 80s, that was AIDS. Saturn-Pluto opposition in the early 60s was Vietnam. Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Leo was World War II. So we can go throughout this the whole all day long. But that's important context to understand because we're not going through a Saturn-Pluto opposition. So this is going to look a lot different. But I think that's important to understand that the thing that represents the Vietnam War is not what's going on right now. It's just the Saturn transit that we're looking at. But then March 9th, the turnaround Tuesday, march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, under the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., stops at the site of Bloody Sunday to hold a prayer service and return to Selma. In obedience to a court restraining order on the same day, white supremacists attack 3 white ministers, leaving Unitarian Universalist minister James J. Reeb in a coma. Why this is interesting is 2 things that you will see as Saturn goes into Pisces is Jesus. We all know Jesus isn't actually a Pisces, he's actually a Virgo, and that's a whole nother story we can get into. But something you see constantly as you go through Pisces stuff is Jesus stuff coming up. There's quite a few Jesus stuff that we'll talk about, but also cults coming up at the same time. So there's this weird religious aspect that gets brought into play where it's this binary between Jesus and, occultism. And what's interesting about MLK was he was I'm totally going to butcher this and correct me if I'm wrong. He was either a priest or he was a priest, right? I'm trying to think of the other word that there is for that, like or a minister. I can't remember. I don't know. I couldn't even tell you what really the difference between those two is. But a lot of his message was like through prayer and through God, which is I think really important for that movement. And also what you'll see too is the opposite of that, which was the Black Panther Party being, and that's something that we'll talk about with Saturn and Pisces, that comes up. And so you see this kind of two two roads of going down for the same, or two different means to an end, if that makes sense. One is very, Christian. One is very Jesus oriented. The other is, I wouldn't really call Black Panther like a cult or anything like that, but it's definitely not like rooted in the Bible or anything like that. But anyway, let's go on. March 18th, cosmonaut Alexei Leonov leaves his Voskhod 2 spacecraft for 12 minutes, becoming the first person to walk in space. Pretty cool. March 23rd, Gemini 3. NASA launches the United States' first two-person crew, Gus Grissom and John Young, into Earth orbit. And let me also say this too. This was Saturn in Pisces and Jupiter in Taurus. Remember that, because that's what's going on this time. And also, in the 1900s, it was Saturn in Pisces, Jupiter in Taurus. March 28th, at least 400 are killed or missing after an earthquake triggered a series of dam failures in La Ligua, Chile. Some more earthquake stuff. And trust me, there's a lot of earthquake stuff we're going to go up to. April 28th, U.S. troops occupy the Dominican Republic. This is a big deal, as we'll eventually go on as we go on through this video, because I don't know if you know, right now, the U.S. is trying to throw a coup and trying to install a government in Haiti, which Dominican Republic and Haiti are the same island. And it's a bunch of bullshit like usual. But you're seeing that currently right now. And and as we go along, you will see that keep happening with Saturn and Pisces. I have no idea what symbolizes Haiti or Dominican Republic with Pisces. I don't think there's really anything to look at there. But what I'm looking for is repeating themes. And what was going on during these times that we can relate to right now, and if there's anything to connect. May 1st, the Battle of Dongyin occurs as a conflict between Taiwan and the People's Republic of China. This is a big deal because, again, as we'll go on, China and Taiwan have these little minor conflicts that happen with Saturn and Pisces. And if China invades Taiwan, it's a really big deal. Like, and not just, a big deal because it's a war. It's a big deal for how the economy is ran right now. And you will see the effects of that here in America much more than we felt the effects of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So keep your eyes out for that. So here's what's interesting. Now we're going to start talking about specific days, because when I was looking at 1965, there was like a whole Wikipedia section for May and June of 1965. So now we're just looking at May of 1965, which was the peak of the Saturn-Pluto opposition. May 1965, 40 male students at the University of California in Berkeley stood in front of the city's draft board office and burned their draft cards, introducing what would become a common form of an anti-war protest and refusal to join the war effort. Blah, 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 blah. It's just a little bit more about that. Pretty much burning draft cards. Again, I can't tell you what the exact significance of Saturn and Pisces in that being. It's not like there was any like major fire transits going on during that time. But again, war, we'll keep going about it. This one was interesting to me though. May 5th, 1965. Boss Radio, a music programming format that relied on less talking by the disc jockeys, shorter commercials, and more frequent play of the most popular songs of the week, was introduced by a Los Angeles radio station, KHJ-AM. The concept, developed by Bill Drake and Gene Chenault, along with Gary Mack and Les Turpin, relied on playing the same 33 songs throughout the day, punctuated occasionally by older records. The plan debuted had actually been for May 19th, but a disgruntled news announcer at KHJ revealed the plans to a rival radio station's KFWB, so KHJ disc jockey Don Steele rushed the Boss Radio format on the air the same afternoon. KFWB retreated from stealing the KHJ idea. The, quote, more music, less talk format would quickly be adopted by other radio stations in the United States. This is a really big deal because, that kind of changed the way that the radio is. And I can imagine now that streaming is so prevalent, the radio stations figuring something else out in order to bring up different forms of media. So I just thought that was really interesting. And there's a few more radio things that we're going to go over as we keep talking. May 10th, this one was just interesting to me. So keep your eyes out on Berkshire Hathaway. But Warren Buffett, an investor from Omaha, Nebraska, and a recent millionaire, completed 3 years of purchasing stock in Berkshire Hathaway Company. A financially ailing textile manufacturer achieved a controlling interest and fired the former president, C. Barry Stanton. Buffett's initial motivation was revenge against Stanton for an insult that arose when Stanton verbally offered to buy Berkshire's existing stock at the rate of $11.50 per share, but then sent a written agreement changing the terms to $11.375 per share. Over the next decades, Buffett would transform Berkshire Hathaway into a $500 billion conglomerate that now owns Geico, Dairy Queen, Helzberg Diamonds, the Fruit of the Loom, and other corporations. So the only thing, for one, Warren Buffett's dope as fuck. But I would be interested about the Saturn return of Berkshire Hathaway. Maybe this isn't the exact Saturn return. I just thought this was interesting. So, Warren Buffett has a really interesting chart too. I'd recommend looking it up. But we'll keep going on about this. I just thought this was an interesting note. Again, in this video, there are things that are very specific to Saturn and Pisces, and there are other things like, this is just something interesting that I thought. Because at the end of the day, what's fun about astrology is learning history. Like, history is so important. If you don't understand history, it's going to be hard to really understand where you're at right now in life, what it means to be a human being in the 21st century. This was really interesting to me. May 15th, 1965, President Johnson ordered the United States Mint to resume production of silver dollars for the first time since 1935. So exactly 30 years before, with directions that 45 million new coins would be minted and that they will be distributed in the areas of the country where the silver dollar has traditionally been used as a medium of exchange. However, because of a shortage of silver and uncertainty about the metal composition, dollar coins would not be reintroduced until 1971, and that was around the time we got off the gold standard. So I think you're going to, gold and silver, if the BRICS nations develop a currency, and the BRICS nations are like Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and BRICS. Yeah. They could easily be pegging their currency to the gold. And I think you're going to be seeing a lot of currency wars going on with both, America's central bank digital currency and our hegemony around the world. You're going to see some opposition to that. And I would imagine that silver and gold have, again, I'm not like a economist or like a investor, person, but it's interesting that this was, again, silver dollar prediction 1935, 30 years later, 1965. So again, Saturn and Pisces things, silver coming back up. And if we did go to a gold standard or a gold backed currency, you would see a lot of silver, because gold is worth like 2,000 an ounce right now, essentially. And what are you going to do? Buy a piece of bread with 2,000 an ounce of gold? You're probably going to see silver as much more of an easier means of exchange. So let's keep going on. May 19th, American inventor Paul C. Fisher filed for the patent on the anti-gravity pen, known also as the space pen, which used a pressurized ink supply which enables the pen to write when the force of gravity acts against the flow of ink in the ink cartridge, in order for astronauts to write data observations in a weightless environment. So this is what was news to me, this next part. Although there is an urban legend that NASA spent millions of dollars to develop an unnecessary replacement to a pencil, Fisher was privately funded and earned his cost back when both the American and Soviet space programs began purchasing pens, which were necessary because of the hazards of broken pencil tips, graphite dust, and flammable wood. The pens themselves were sold for $6 a piece. So interesting. May 22nd, 1965, So a lot of Saturn and Pisces is very cultural too, because in the 60s, you had a lot of the hippie movement. You had the psychedelic movement, which is stuff that we're going to be talking about here in just a moment. But it's very cultural. The new sport of skateboarding received its first wide recognition as the first annual national skateboarding competitions were conducted in Anaheim, California, and videotaped for a nationwide broadcast. The 2-day event, which attracted contestants from as far away as Japan, Mexico, New York, Texas, and Washington, featured a downhill and flatland slalom, trick performances, and a figure 8 skating event, and took place in La Palma Stadium in Anaheim. So I clicked on the skateboarding Wikipedia link, and I was reading through it, and I copied and pasted this. One of the earliest skateboard exhibitions was sponsored by Makana's founder, Larry Stevenson, in 1963, and held at the Pier Avenue Junior High School in Hermosa Beach, California. Some of these same teams of skateboarders were also featured on a television show called Surf's Up in 1964, that helped promote skateboarding as something new and fun to do. So if you don't know the history of skateboarding started from surfers who wanted to surf, but when the waves were bad or they couldn't go actually surfing. So it was like city surfing. So that's very Pisces, right? Like, again, like just a board, like urban surfing is a way to look at it. So, and also when we go into the 90s too, like when X Games got big, and fucking skateboarding got huge in the 90s. I just thought that this was really interesting that you see this come up with a Saturn and Pisces thing, and given the fact that it came from surfing. June 2nd, 1965, the first contingent of Australian combat troops to fight in the Vietnam War arrived in South Vietnam. At the same time, on June 2nd, Gemini 4 was launched from Cape Kennedy at 11:16 in the morning with Ed White and James McDivitt on board. At 3:45 p.m., when the craft was making its third orbit and passing at an altitude of 135 miles above the southern United States, White became the first U.S. astronaut and the only second person after Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov had ventured outside of Voskhod 2 on March 18th to walk in space. White stayed outside the capsule for 20 minutes as the ship moved at 17,000 miles an hour. I'm pretty sure I'm related to this guy too. All of my white ancestors, and when I say white, my last name, like my dad's side, they're all dead. And I do have like a Life magazine from this. And it's important because, well, my grandpa worked for Lockheed Martin in the 60s. They were actually doing a lot of the chemical engineering for the rocket fuel. And then I was just trying to find this out this morning. I'm pretty sure my grandma worked for Skunk Works in the 60s for a small time, just doing like administrative stuff. So I'm connected to this for some reason. I got to figure out more about that though. June 10th, British European Airways Flight 343 became the first civilian jetliner to make an almost completely automatic landing. Technically, the landing was an auto flare because the pilot continued to control the yaw and the roll of the Trident 1C jet, while a computer guided the pitch during the descent to London's Heathrow Airport. This I thought was interesting just in terms of automation and technology. Again, you're talking a lot about like the Virgo stuff going on, but as we move into this new automated world with Pluto and Aquarius and Saturn and Pisces, I wonder what other things are just going to see. I mean, we're going to see most everything become automatic, but interesting that we just see that happening here. So this one is a really important one. On that same day, on June 10th, Pope Paul VI praised astronomer Galileo Galilei during a visit to Pisa, almost 350 years after Pope Paul V had ordered an inquisition that rejected Galileo's idea that the Earth moves around the sun. Although Galileo was not rehabilitated from charges of heresy, which still had not happened as of 2017, the pontiff's praise for the great mind of Galileo was the first from the Roman Catholic Church since Galileo's death in 1642. The church suppressed the truth. This is something Richard Tarnas talks about in Cosmos and Psyche. Astronomers and astrologers, and that in the 1600s was around the time where, like, because back then every astronomer was an astrologer, and then that kind of started separating during the scientific revolution and things like that. But we knew about this, and you have to understand the authorities, which at a long time the Roman Catholic Church was the authority, censored that. They rejected that, and lo and behold, we were right. And when I say Galileo Galilei was on our team, in my opinion, or at least I'm going to say he's on our team. But this is just one of those things that I thought was really cool to understand with Saturn and Pisces. So let's keep going on because we have so much more to go on. I'm not even close to being done yet. June 13th, 1965. On the final day that the Berlin Wall was open to visitors from traveling to West Berlin to East Berlin, 70,000 people came over from West Germany to see their relatives for 2 weeks under an agreement between East Germany and West Germany on September 24th, 1964. So again, Saturn and Pisces, West Berliners were allowed to travel passes to come through 5 checkpoints at the wall, but the agreement expired at midnight. During the pass period, 600,000 people obtained passes. The wall technically closed at midnight, a UPI reporter noted, but actually guards kept crossing points open for stragglers. So you see this like wall border open up a little bit more, and there's more crossings. So again, and the Berlin Wall came up when Saturn was in Capricorn, came down with Saturn in Capricorn. You saw the Trump being like, we need to build the wall with Saturn and Capricorn. And then Aquarius is like that divide. Like, once the Berlin Wall is up, there's this weird, divide between East and West Germany. But this Pisces stuff, you see this integration. You see this wall becoming more permeable. June 14th, 1965, Yesterday, which would go on to become the most covered song in history with renditions by over 3,000 recording artists in the first 40 years, was recorded for the first time. Paul McCartney would say later that he had literally dreamed up the melody in late 1964, reconstructed it on a piano after waking up, but avoided composing lyrics for it because he was certain that it was a subconscious memory of someone else's work. When it became clear that it was unfamiliar to any of the experts that he played it for, he perfected it as an addition to the soundtrack for the Beatles film Help. Saturn and Pisces. I have a dream of a song, and the song becomes a huge deal. He also has Mercury retrograde too. June 16th, 1965, the U.S. Senate voted 72-5 to approve the Federal Cigarette Labeling and Advertising Act, which would require the warning label on all packs of cigarettes with the statement, "Caution, cigarette smoking may be hazardous to your health." I thought that was interesting given what we talked about as we started. On the same day, on the 16th, the U.S. House of Representatives voted 217-104 to create a cabinet level, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. This was cool because in the Sibley chart, which is what most astrologers use for the chart of America, has Pisces ruling the fourth house of the home, and you have Saturn ruling governments and authorities. And it created a Department of Housing and Urban Development during this time. I thought that was really interesting. June 19th, this one's not necessarily Saturn and Pisces. I just thought this was just cool to talk about. Astronomers Gordon H. Pettengill and Rolf B. Dice published their paper, A Radar Determination of the Rotation of the Planet Mercury, in the British scientific journal Nature, disproving the belief that the rotation of the planet Mercury was 87.96 days and equal to its revolution around the sun. Using radar observations at various points of the planet's surface, the two scientists concluded that the planet's rotation was roughly 59 days, later refined to 59.65 days, so that its day was roughly 2/3 as long as its year, rather than being exactly the same. Interesting, kind of cool. Here's some more Saturn and Pisces stuff for you. June 20th, 1965, two young scuba divers, 19-year-old Paul, I can't say his last name, Paul, and 20-year-old David Rose disappeared after plunging into a 200-foot deep Devil's Hole, a geothermal pool in Nye County, Nevada. Accompanied by two other adventurers, the two men went into the 90-degree hot waters to explore an underwater cavern that led to a subterranean river. When Paul didn't return, Rose went to his rescue and vanished as well. The only trace ever found by rescuers was a flashlight that had been strapped at the main shaft at the cavern opening. The search would be abandoned on June 30th, and their bodies would never be recovered. So don't jump into 90-degree devil's holes during Saturn and Pisces. I don't think that would be a good idea. June 20, and again, like I said, the reason we're still in June of 1965. There is two Wikipedia articles that were just May of 65, June of 65, and this was the height of that Saturn-Pluto opposition. It was also Uranus conjoining Pluto and Saturn opposite Uranus too. So this was like the main highlights of that time. This one was really interesting. June 21st, 1965, President Johnson signed a bill substantially lowering federal excise taxes on the manufacturers of many popular consumer products, including cars and trucks, televisions and radios, refrigerators and freezers, air conditioners, cameras, films, sporting goods, musical instruments, pens, playing cards, and matches for 1965. Tax cuts on air conditioners and automobiles were made retroactive to May 15th, blah, 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 blah. I'm talking about a rebate. I cannot sit here and tell you what I think that has to do with Saturn and Pisces. If there's anything from that, but I just thought, I mean, like that just made what we look at as consumer, goods, that are so prevalently available to us right now, a lot cheaper and a lot more affordable. So just kind of normalize them. So interesting. And also just tech stuff. Pluto and Pisces, Pluto in Virgo, Saturn and Pisces. This was really interesting. So now we're getting a little bit more to the geopolitics area. You see a lot of treaties between Korea and Japan happen during Saturn and Pisces. So June 22nd, 1965, the Treaty of Basic Relations between Japan and the Republic of Korea was signed in Tokyo, almost 20 years after South Korea had been liberated from being ruled by the Japanese Empire. Among the provisions in the treaty was the clause that, quote, all of the treaties or agreements concluded between the Empire of Japan and the Empire of Korea on or before August 22nd, 1910 are already null and void, unquote. Besides establishing formal diplomatic and commercial relations between Japan and South Korea, it also included an expression of apology from Japan for its treatment of the Korean people, which was met with widespread hostile reaction in both countries, as either not enough remorse or too much. The treaty would enter into force on December 18th, 1965. And we'll have more of that come up. And this is why, and the reason I'm starting with the 60s and then going into the 90s and then going into the 1910s and the 30s is it's going to be easier to connect the dots this way rather than just starting from, the 1900s and going forward. And also the 60s were a really crazy time. June 30th, 1965, New York became the first state in the United States to require apartment building landlords to provide a peephole for all entrance doors for apartment units. The bill, prompted by an increase in crime and signed by Governor Nelson Rockefeller, gave landlords 6 months to make the necessary installations so the tenants could see outside without opening the door. So Saturn and Pisces, because the people is literally like a fisheye lens, and you're talking about a wall and being able to see through the wall to the other side. Like, again, that permeability of walls. I know it's a door, but bear with me. July 30th. So now we're out of that May and June time. So this is a big one. Big deal right here. July 30th, War on Poverty. U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson signs the Social Security Act of 1965 into law, establishing Medicare and Medicaid. So as we go into the 30s, Social Security was signed. The actual Social Security was signed in the 1930s when Saturn was in Pisces. And then we have the Social Security Act of 1965 establishing Medicare and Medicaid. And as you saw in the State of the Union address, again, yeah, of course, Republicans want to take Medicare and Medicaid, but also the guy that Biden brought in to like run Medicare or run Social Security is like the biggest guy that's like wants to get rid of Social Security. Both sides want to take those things away from you. Please don't get it twisted. But I can imagine either one. I don't think those benefits are going to expand in any way. Besides the, them having to peg it to inflation. So of course, people got more money from their Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, but I would imagine over these next 3 years, you're going to see Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security come really into contention, along with, again, the immigration stuff. October 10th, the first group of Cuban refugees traveled to the U.S. This is another thing. A bunch of stuff with Cuba goes on with Saturn and Pisces, and I don't know what to make of that. So now we're in 1966. We're at the last part of Saturn and Pisces here. Gosh, I'm almost an hour into this just talking about the 60s. But this was really a lot was going on. Again, this was Saturn and Pisces and Jupiter and Taurus. March 4th, the Beatles, in an interview published in the London Evening Standard, John Lennon comments, "We're more popular than Jesus now," sparking a controversy in the United States. Some more Jesus stuff comes up. March 8th, Vietnam War. U.S. announces it will substantially increase its number of troops in Vietnam. March 26th, demonstrations are held across the U.S. against the Vietnam War. April 8th, look at this one. April 8th, Time magazine, so Saturn, Time, cover story asks, "Is God dead?" And this is where you really see the cult stuff coming up. April 13th, President Lyndon Johnson signs the 1966 Uniform Time Act dealing with daylight savings time. This was interesting to me because in the history of Pluto and Aquarius, Benjamin Franklin was like, we need to do daylight savings. And just recently, the Senate passed a bill where they're like, let's get rid of daylight savings. And so we see the daylight savings thing come up with Saturn and Pisces. April 29th, U.S. troops in Vietnam total 250,000. April 30th, the Church of Satan is formed by Anton Sandor LaVey in San Francisco. I didn't know it was formed in San Francisco, which is so funny. But I love that it's like Jesus stuff coming around, but then also you have like the Church of Satan being formed with Saturn and Pisces. And we're going to talk about more cult stuff that happens with Saturn and Pisces. We're not done yet. So I just thought this was really interesting, especially because just before that, like 2 weeks before that, the Time magazine cover story asks, "Is God dead?" And we're just seeing a lot of the Satanist and Christian stuff coming up again already. Like you're seeing a lot of people revert back to secular religion and go back into Christianity. And then you're also seeing a lot of people like, what you saw at the Grammys being like, Satan is cool and we love Satan. June 13th, Miranda versus Arizona. The Supreme Court of the United States rules that the police must inform suspects of their rights before questioning them. This was cool to me. My high school did not have like any really good elective classes. Like they all sucked. And so one of the ones that was actually pretty fun was law enforcement because the teacher was sick as fuck. And we learned a lot about Miranda versus Arizona. And if you want to learn more about Supreme Court briefs, I would really recommend the channel Mr. Beat. Not Mr. Beast, Mr. Beat. He's like this high school teacher that he's really good about United States history, but he has a whole series on Supreme Court cases. But why this is Saturn and Pisces is being Mirandized is, quote, "You have the right to remain silent." Pisces is a mute sign. Like people who have Mercury and Pisces are more notably quieter because it's a mute sign. So I just love that we get this right of, you have the right to remain silent, like at least an authority having to address that to you. Very Saturn and Pisces. So I like that. July 4th, President Lyndon B. Johnson signs the Freedom of Information Act, which goes into effect the following year. Big deal. Love the FOIA. September 8th, the classic science fiction series Star Trek premieres on NBC with its first episode titled The Man Trap. So this actually started with a Mercury Cazimi in Virgo. Again, that Virgo Pisces, like sci-fi, is really big during this time. So here we go, another cult. September 19th, Timothy Leary forms the spiritual group League for Spiritual Discovery, LSD. So we get some more cult stuff going on. And then October, Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton found the Black Panther Party. So again, just kind of that binary between like, and again, this isn't me. I have a lot of mixed feelings about the Black Panther Party, not both on, again, both sides, but you just see these two roads of like, again, like more people, I don't know how to say it. Like you have the Martin Luther King version of doing things, and then you have the Black Panther Party version of doing things, which is just an interesting binary to look at. October 5th, an experimental breeder reactor at the Enrico Fermi Nuclear Generating Station in Michigan suffers a partial meltdown when its cooling system fails. So that's something else that you see is like nuclear accidents kind of coming up during Saturn and Pisces. We'll talk more about that in a minute. October 6th, LSD is made illegal in the United States and controlled so strictly that not only are possessions and recreational use criminalized, but all legal scientific research programs on the drug in the country are shut down as well. Saturn and Pisces, you're not allowed to expand your consciousness. Funny. October 15th, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson signs a bill creating the United States Department of Transportation. When I made this, I just thought this was interesting, but now given the derailment over in Ohio with all of the chemicals in the air and the fact that Pete Buttigieg runs the Department of Transportation, and he's like in the most wildest times of transportation, he's like butchered it. So I almost wonder if there's going to be any other developments with the Department of Transportation. So now we only have a little bit of 1967. This is when Saturn was leaving Pisces. The Human Be-In takes place in Golden Gate Park, San Francisco. The event set the stage for the Summer of Love. I thought this was interesting because the Summer of Love unfortunately happened with Saturn and Aries. I say unfortunately because it would have been way cooler for Saturn and Pisces, but it's interesting that this kind of set the tone for what the Summer of Love was going to be. January 27th, the United States and Soviet Union, United Kingdom signed the Outer Space Treaty, ratified by the USSR on May 19th, prohibiting weapons of mass destruction from space. Cool. No nukes in space. Very Virgo, Pisces, Saturn, and Pluto, right? February 10th, the 25th Amendment to the United States Constitution, presidential secession and disability is ratified. So this is what's interesting to me is because this has come up more and more over recent years. First, it was with Trump. Everyone's like, Trump's too old. We need to do the 25th Amendment. But now we have Joe Biden, who's literally has dementia. And only one side talks about it. I would, and this is the other thing. I still have a hard feeling that Biden is not going to finish his presidency. And at first I made a prediction in 2022 that I thought he was going to die on July 6th. I was wrong, but he did get COVID on July 6th. So I was close kind of. But Kamala Harris is getting her Saturn return on her midheaven and her Jupiter return, which is her midheaven ruler in the 12th house, during 2023. So I can honestly, and some people say that they're going to oust Kamala Harris. I think if anything, she would become president first before she got ousted. And so I wonder if the 25th Amendment comes into play with that. So we'll see. So now we're in the 1990s. And at this point, Saturn only very early just dipped in to Pisces by June. All right. So sorry, I had to take a quick break real quick. 1993, Saturn dips into Pisces for just a minute. June 5th, Minnesota versus Dickerson. The United States Supreme Court rules that the seizure of evidence during a pat-down search is constitutional. I don't know how I feel about that, but I thought this was just interesting to bring up. June 11th, Jurassic Park, directed by Steven Spielberg, is released in theaters as the first film in the Jurassic Park saga. This was really interesting to me because right now, and I'm pretty sure the Biden administration actually talked about this. I can't remember, but they're working on reviving mammoths and taking the DNA from woolly mammoths that we had during the Ice Age and like bringing them back to the world to kind of like fight climate change. I have a lot of mixed feelings about that. Part of me is like, that's super cool. The other part of me is like, what the fuck? That's almost crazy. But I do think that that's interesting that Jurassic Park, the whole idea of that came out with Saturn and Pisces, and yet here we are 30 years later pretty much practicing that science. June 27th, U.S. President Bill Clinton orders a cruise missile attack on Iraqi intelligence headquarters in the Al Mansour district of Baghdad in response to attempted assassination of the former U.S. President George H.W. Bush during his visit to Kuwait in mid-April. I don't know why I really brought that up because the Gulf War had already ended by this point, but there is some stuff with the Gulf War that still kind of continues. So that was 1993. Saturn just dipped into Pisces and went back into Aquarius. And then we get to 1994 where Saturn actually enters Aquarius. So, I mean, my bad, Pisces. So now we're in 1994, and here we go. The Immigration and Nationality Technical Corrections Act of 1994. So here we go with the immigration stuff again, like right on time with Saturn and Pisces. January 14th, U.S. President Bill Clinton and Russian President Boris Yeltsin signed the Kremlin Accords, which stopped the pre-programmed aiming of nuclear missiles towards each other's countries' targets. So we see more nuclear de-escalation during this time, which, again, this gives me a lot of hope that hopefully nuclear bombs won't be used in this next war with Russia. I mean, because that war is happening. I hope to God nukes don't get used, but this is a sign of hope, in my opinion. And also provide for the dismantling of the nuclear arsenal in Ukraine. This is interesting because when you talk about this whole Ukraine thing, we're talking about the Minsk Accords, we're talking about the Kremlin Accords, there's so much back and forth with whether or not NATO was supposed to push farther than East Germany, whether or not we were supposed to help defend Ukraine from nuclear arsenal against Russia. All of this, again, comes into question with Saturn and Pisces, and here we are coming into that same question. January 17th, the 6.7 magnitude Northridge earthquake strikes the greater Los Angeles area with a maximum Mercalli Institute of IX, violent, leaving 57 people dead and more than 8,700 injured. Northridge earthquake was a big deal. My dad, he was a firefighter during that time and helped do all that stuff. One of the biggest earthquakes in California's history, and the other one, the San Francisco earthquake, which we'll get to, also happened with Saturn and Pisces. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was a major earthquake in California. January 19th, record cold temperatures hit the eastern United States, the coldest temperature ever measured in Indiana state history. There's also another thing that we're going to talk about with Indiana that's super fucked up. Negative 36 degrees Fahrenheit is recorded New Whiteland, Indiana. So also too, some mountain in Washington just recorded its coldest wind chill temperature in record history is like negative 108 or something like that, or negative 130. I can't remember. But you see a lot of coldness. And this is something too that I've done a lot of podcasts with SJ, and I can't remember if we talked about this on one of the Pluto Pilled episodes we did with Dan. But he talks about, I believe he brings up Dane Rudgier talking about that the storms of Pisces wash away any of the Aquarius stuff that happens, and that Pisces is much more of a violent sign in terms of like weather conditions than Aquarius. And you'll see a lot of weather events happen with Saturn and Pisces as we go along. But also to note, in the 90s, this was just Saturn and Pisces. Now, interestingly enough, in 1994, the nodes, the eclipses were both in Scorpio and Taurus. So there is a little bit of a similarity of 1994 with 2023, but the 1960s was much more current to 2023, or much more relevant. February 21st, revealing the first photo of Pluto and its moon Charon taken from the Hubble Space Telescope. This was interesting to me. Again, more science and space stuff that we see going on here. And that picture of Pluto was a really big deal. March 8th, Nine Inch Nails' second studio album, The Downward Spiral, was released to critical acclaim. I'm not a big Nine Inch Nails fan, but in the 60s, you had like the hippie psychedelic movement, which also did that. I must have not pasted it, but the term psychedelic first was coined with Saturn and Pisces too. And the LSD stuff was a really big deal. But in the 90s, you get the grunge movement. You kind of get the punk movement going on. And I know that was more of an 80s thing too. But again, a lot of Saturn and Pisces is very cultural. April 5th, Kurt Cobain, the lead singer of Nirvana, commits suicide at age 27 at his home in Seattle. His body was found 3 days later. April 7th, the Rwandan genocide begins in Kigali, Rwanda. That was a huge deal. Like when I started learning about it, I've always known about the Rwandan genocide, but then I looked it up and it's really fucked up. So I thought that was interesting. I don't know. There's not too much other things that there were some things in the 60s that was coming up with Africa, but there wasn't anything hyper specific. So I can't say much about what's going to be going on in Africa. I just thought this was interesting. So May 10th, this all happens. This next four things I'm going to talk about happens on May 10th. and this was a solar eclipse that went over America. Nelson Mandela is inaugurated as South Africa's first black president. The Pinkaba Six, including future political candidate Mark Ellis, kidnapped 3 indigenous children in Fortitude Valley, Brisbane. But check this out. This was crazy that this was on an eclipse. Serial killer John Wayne Gacy is executed by lethal injection in Statville Correctional Center. And on the same day, serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer is baptized in prison. Getting baptized on an eclipse is so appropriate for Jeffrey Dahmer. But I thought that was really interesting. May 18th, the Flavor Saver, a genetically modified tomato, is deemed safe for consumption by the FDA, becoming the first commercially grown genetically engineered food to be granted a license for human consumption. Big deal, because more and more people are starting to become aware of what GMOs are and how pretty much everything is a GMO. And we're seeing the Saturn return of GMOs at this point and, chemicals in our food. And I just thought that this was really interesting that the first GMO was granted, safe from the FDA. And I wonder how much of that changes. I think on one end, more genetically modified foods. I mean, like you see the stupid vegan burger is going to be more promoted, but I think you're also going to see a major resistance to that as you've seen since then. June 6th through June 8th, the ceasefire negotiations with the Yugoslav war begin in Geneva. They agree to a 1-month cessation of hostilities, which does not last more than a few days. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but what's important about the Yugoslav war was this is the first issue. This is the first time NATO forces ever really were used. And they were used very lightly, but I thought it was interesting that NATO kind of comes into the picture with Saturn and Pisces. Here we go. Here's some fun stuff. June 12th, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Lyle Goldman are murdered outside the Simpson home in Los Angeles. O.J. Simpson is later acquitted of the killings, but he's held liable in a civil suit. That happened when Mercury stationed retrograde. 5 days later, NFL star O.J. Simpson and his friend Al Cowlings flee from police in a white Ford Bronco. The low-speed chase ends at Simpson's Brentwood, Los Angeles mansion where he surrenders. Interesting. I thought that was just a little fun. The Lion King, the highest-grossing hand-drawn animated film of all time, is released by Walt Disney Feature Animation. Again, more of this Disney stuff, and we're not done yet. We're going to go more into it, but that was really interesting. June 25th, Cold War, the last Russian troops leave Germany. This is 1994. This is after the Soviet Union dissolved. So again, kind of a whole different period of history here. June 28th, members of the Aum Shinrikyo cult execute the first sarin gas attack at Matsumoto, Japan, killing 8 and injuring 200. This is a really, really big deal. I forgot when I learned about this. It was something to do with like magnetism that I learned about this cult, and UFOs, but they hang out in the middle of the outback of Australia now. But this cult was, again, you see this cult stuff coming up with Saturn and Pisces. This is a really big deal in Japan, and we have another thing to talk about with them. July 5th, 1994, Jeff Bezos founds Amazon. Amazon's going to be going through its Saturn return, which I'm really curious about because that's a big deal. That's a really big deal. So I don't know what to make of it, but all I know is that it's going through its first Saturn return. July 8th, North Korean President Kim Il-sung dies, but officially continues to hold office. I thought that was funny that a dead person is still in control. And again, we see a lot of Korea, Japan stuff come in, but I wonder, I was looking at Kim Jong-il. Who's the fucker that runs North Korea? Kim Jong-il, right? Kim Jong-un. I'm wondering what happens with him during this time, if anything does. And when I looked him up the other day, it was like a news story that just came out hours before that was like, Kim Jong-un hasn't been seen in like a month. So I wonder if something happens to him, which is important because from what I understand, he doesn't have a child. So North Korea something will happen. August 16th, the release of the IBM Simon smartphone, being the first ever commercially available smartphone. Interesting. Smartphones come out with Saturn and Pisces. The Russian army leaves Estonia and Latvia, ending the last traces of Eastern Europe period Soviet occupation. And I know one of these countries is part of NATO now. I can't remember if it's Lithuania or Estonia. It's one of them, but I thought this was really interesting that they leave. September 3rd, Cold War, Russia and the People's Republic of China agreed to de-target their nuclear weapons against each other. September 13th, President Bill Clinton signs the federal assault weapons ban, which bans the manufacture of new firearms with certain features for a period of 10 years. Interesting. Right after I made this, after I was doing this research, in the State of the Union address, Biden was like, let's ban assault weapons. And he also tweeted about it. So I wouldn't be surprised if the assault weapon ban comes back. I have a lot of opinions about that, but that's not for here. So September 19th, U.S. troops stage a bloodless invasion of Haiti to restore the legitimately elected leader Jean-Bertrand Aristide to power. So if you're not paying it, again, getting good info about all this is very difficult, but there is a big thing going on with Haiti right now, and the U.S. is trying to stage an invasion. September through October, Iraqi disarmament crisis. Iraq threatens to stop cooperating with UNSCOM inspectors and begins to once again deploy troops near its border with Kuwait. In response, the U.S. begins to deploy troops in Kuwait. So again, that's post-Gulf War. I'm also might start rushing this a little bit because my battery's about to die on my camera. So anyway, let's keep going. October 4th in Switzerland, 23 members of the Order of the Solar Temple cult are found dead a day after 25 of their fellow cultists are similarly discovered in Morne Heights, Quebec. So again, more cult stuff. When I looked this up, this has something to do with like the Knights Templar stuff, but kind of a shame. Really cool name though. Order of the Solar Temple. October 12th. This was interesting. NASA loses radio contact with the Magellan spacecraft as the probe descends into the thick atmosphere of Venus. The spacecraft presumably burned up in the atmosphere either October 13th or 14th. This happened when Venus stationed retrograde on Jupiter. I thought that was really interesting. November 8th, Georgia Representative Newt Gingrich leads the United States Republican Party in taking control of both the House of Representatives and the Senate in midterm congressional elections. The first time in 40 years, the Republicans secured control both houses of Congress. George W. Bush is elected governor of Texas. So why I thought this was interesting is that this was a part of my prediction why I thought there would be a bigger red wave during the midterm elections, because that's also just historically speaking, whoever is the incumbent, the opposite party comes into power with the House. But Lyndon B. Johnson became the president of Texas, and that's how he became the president, essentially. He was governor of Texas, came to be the vice president, then all of a sudden the president. And you see George W. Bush, governor of Texas, eventually becoming the president of the United States. So I wonder if we see any of that get repeated, but that's kind of going to be a 5-10 year long thing that happens. Online service America Online offers gateway to World Wide Web for the first time. This marked the beginning of the easy accessibility of the web to the average person in the US. This is a big deal because most astrologers agree, like the internet is very Aquarian, but it's interesting that the gateway for it and the accessibility of it comes much more to the public with America Online with Saturn and Pisces. So I wonder what other technologies come more, whether that's VR or AR or AI becomes much more publicly available. 1995, January 31st, Mexican peso crisis. U.S. President Bill Clinton invokes emergency powers to extend a $20 billion loan to help Mexico avert financial collapse. This was interesting because at the December of 1994, there was this something to do with, I forgot what it was. It was called like the tequila short squeeze or something. I didn't copy and paste it. I was like, oh, that's interesting, but I don't think that's important. But then I went to 1995 and so something happened in Mexico with I forgot what happened. If you guys know about it, let me know. But I thought this was interesting given what's going on with Mexico right now. March 20th, members of the Doomsday Cult Aum Shinrikyo carry out the Tokyo subway sarin attack, killing 14 people and leading to over 1,000 injured. The attack remains the deadliest terrorist incident in Japanese history. So again, more of this cult stuff and that same cult coming back. March 31st, American singer Selena is murdered by her fan club president, Yolanda Saldivar. This is important. The only reason I thought this was interesting is, for one, culturally, that was a big fucking deal. R.I.P. Selena. But she was also 23. She was in a 12th house year of hidden enemies, and here is her club president. April 7th, First Chechnyan War, Samashki massacre. Russian paramilitary troops begin a massacre of at least 250 civilians in Samashki, Chechnya. Thought that was interesting. April 19th, the Oklahoma City bombing. 168 people, including 8 federal marshals and 19 children, are killed with Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, and 680 are wounded by a bomb set up by Timothy McVeigh. That was really crazy. Can't really relate this to anything Saturn and Pisces, but again, a lot of this is like, again, this is why I said this in the beginning. A lot of this is like Saturn is in Pisces things to like, yes, this is totally Saturn and Pisces, but other things I'm like, this is kind of just interesting in terms of historically speaking, what comes up of this. And it's just fun to learn history. Here's the kicker. Sega launches the Saturn game console in North America 4 months before its initial scheduled date. So we'll talk about this in just more video games in a minute, but video games come up a lot here, which video games have been around since the 60s, and I didn't see anything about like Pong. I wonder when Pong was released, if it was during Saturn and Pisces, but video games become really big with Saturn and Pisces. July 21st through the 26th, the third Taiwan Strait crisis. The Chinese People's Liberation Army fires missiles into the water of North Taiwan. There you go. More Taiwan escalation things. So that's a Saturn and Pisces thing that we keep seeing reoccurring. I wonder what more will happen. August 30th, the NATO bombing campaign against the Bosnian Serb artillery positions begins in Bosnia and Herzegovina, continuing into September. At the same time, our ARBIH forces begin an offensive against the Bosnian Serb army around Sarajevo, central Bosnia, and Bosnia and Krajina. So this is interesting. This is like really the first use of NATO forces, which is interesting given what's going on with NATO right now. September 3rd, eBay is founded by Pierre Omidyar, so eBay is going to have its Saturn return. September 6th, NATO airstrikes against Bosnian Serb forces continue after repeated attempts at a solution at the Bosnian War fell. September 9th, Sony enters the North American video game market with the release of the PlayStation. So interesting, right? PlayStation's huge. Like that completely shifted American culture when it comes to video games and everything like that. So we see that with Saturn and Pisces. October 3rd, O.J. Simpson is found not guilty of the double murder of the deaths of former wife Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. Big deal there. October 30th, Quebec independent. And see, this was, I just copied and pasted this, but this says it's not a word, and I don't think it is. Quebec independentists narrowly lose a referendum for a mandate to negotiate independence from Canada. I wouldn't be surprised if you saw more independent movements in Canada. There's so many Canadians that hate their government. So and this is also something that's going to happen here in America. So I thought that this was interesting to bring up. November 22nd, the first ever full-length computer animated feature film Toy Story is released by Pixar and Walt Disney Pictures. So again, here we have full-length computer animated feature film. We just had the biggest, hand-drawn animation, The Lion King. And then in the 60s, we have Mary Poppins. So I wonder what's going to be going on with Disney over these next few years. November 30th, Operation Desert Storm officially ends. We're done with the Gulf. We're done with Kuwait. December 14th, the Dayton Agreement is signed in Paris, officially ending the Bosnian War. Here we go with more temperatures. December 30th, the lowest ever United Kingdom temperature of negative 17 degrees Fahrenheit is recorded in Altanahara in the Scottish Highlands. This equals the record set of Braemar. I'm going to fuck all these names up. Braemar, Aberdeenshire in 1895 and 1982. So now we get a little bit of Saturn and Pisces in the 1996. It only dips into Pisces and then goes into Aries. January 7th, one of the worst blizzards in American history hits the eastern states, killing more than 150 people. Philadelphia receives a record 30 inches of snowfall, and New York City's public schools closed for the first time in 18 years. The federal government in Washington, D.C. is closed for several days, extending the time federal employees are out of the office from the 1996 federal government shutdown. February 24th, Cuban fighter jets shoot down 2 American aircraft belonging to the Cuban exile group Brothers to the Rescue. Cuban officials assert that they invaded Cuban airspace. So again, more things with Cuba, and there'll be more to go along here. March 8th, the People's Republic of China begins surface-to-surface missile testing and military exercises off the Taiwanese coastal areas. The United States government condemns the act as a provocation, and the Taiwanese government warns of retaliation. Some more escalation with China and Taiwan. May 20th, gay rights. Romer versus Evans, the Supreme Court of the United States rules against a law that prevents any city, town, or county in the state of Colorado from taking any legislative, executive, or judicial action to protect the rights of homosexuals. The term homosexual is so outdated, it's kind of funny to say. But I thought that was interesting. May 30th, the Hoover Institution releases an optimistic report that global warming will probably reduce mortality in the United States and provide Americans with valuable benefit. I thought this was interesting because this is like, finally something that goes against the climate apocalypse narrative, which wasn't as big around this time. Like people still really didn't believe in global warming as much during this time, but you're starting to see a lot of pushback from that now. Which also too, if you don't know, you should do some more research into it. It's a lot more complicated and not so simple as, oh my God, the climate's changing and the world's going to end. or even that the world will be so bad that humans can't occupy it is just not really true. So look more into it. We'll see what comes up in the next 3 years. June 12th in Philadelphia, a panel of federal judges blocks a law against indecency on the internet. The panel says that the 1996 Communications Decency Act would infringe upon the free speech rights of adults. So again, you see a little bit more freedoms of the internet, being able to do whatever you want there, and I wonder how much that comes into contention. All right, so now we're in 1905, okay? So we're in the 1900s. This is when we are, again, Saturn in Pisces, Jupiter in Taurus. So we see the returns of both of those planets. So we're going to see something relative to the 1960s. June 20th, Dr. Ernest Henry Starling introduces the word hormone into the English language, which I thought was really important because people are starting to finally wake up to their hormonal health and how important it is. Same thing in the trans community with hormones. A lot of people are starting to understand that, injecting hormones that aren't necessarily natural to your body all the time can actually wreak a lot of damage. And the hormonal health of both men and women over the past, 50 years has really gone to shit. And so I thought it was interesting that the term hormone actually comes into the public sphere during a Saturn and Pisces transit. And I wonder how much of hormone science and hormone literature comes more out. June 30th, Albert Einstein submits for publication his paper on the electrodynamics of moving bodies, establishing his theory of special relativity. So here we actually have a lot of current physics, like our model of how the world works coming much more into play. We'll have more about Einstein here in just a moment. July 24th, again, this is 1905. July 24th, an 8.4 magnitude earthquake strikes Mongolia, the second largest on record there. We get some more earthquake stuff. August 20th, Chinese revolutionary leader Sun Yat-sen forms the first chapter of the Tiongmeng-Hui, a union of all secret societies determined to bringing down the Manchu dynasty. So more of the cult secret society stuff. I thought that was so interesting. Here's some real Saturn and Pisces stuff for you guys. August 25th, Theodore Roosevelt becomes the first U.S. president to travel underwater after boarding the Navy submarine USS Plunger. Very Saturn and Pisces. September 8th, the 7.2 magnitude Calabria. I botch all these words. I'm so sorry. Earthquake shakes southern Italy with a maximum Mercalli intensity of XI, extreme, killing between 557 and 2,500 people. I thought this was such a big gap in number. Anyway, this is where more science Einstein stuff comes in. September 27th, Albert Einstein submits for publication his paper, Does the Inertia of a Body Depend Upon Its Energy Content?, in which he puts forward the idea of mass energy equivalence by publishing the famous equation E equals mc squared. So cosmic microwave radiation, Saturn and Pisces, E equals mc squared, Saturn and Pisces. Pretty interesting stuff. October 26th, Sweden and Norway agrees to the repeal of the union with Norway, forming the two modern countries today. And again, this is interesting because I believe Norway is a part of NATO, but Sweden's been trying to get into NATO and Turkey just blocked it. So, and also too, if the Russia stuff continues, that's going to come into play. And I just thought this was interesting to see Sweden and Norway have some more stuff coming up with Saturn and Pisces. October 29th, in the Russian Empire, Russian Revolution of 1905, the Imperial Russian Army opens fire on a meeting at a street market in Tallinn, governorate of Estonia, killing 94 and injuring over 200 people. So when I clicked this link of the Russian Revolution of 1905, a lot of people actually say that this was the beginning of the Russian Revolution, which is important because the actual Russian Revolution was in 1917. And that was the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. So again, I've said this so many times, 1917, Saturn-Neptune, Russian Revolution. 1953, Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Stalin dies, big deal in Russia. 1989, Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Soviet Union falls. Now we're getting to one in 2025 and 2026, and you're going to see another big transition in Russia, as well as Putin has a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in his chart. So I thought that this was interesting that this all kind of came up with a Saturn and Pisces transit. November 17th, the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1905, the Yulsa Treaty, effectively makes Korea a protectorate of Japan. So again, we see this Japan-Korea stuff come up with Saturn and Pisces. These do not have any dates, but this happened in 1905 at some point. Pathé Frères colors black and white films by machine. This one was interesting to me. Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer are banned from the Brooklyn Public Library for setting a bad example. So a little bit more book banning stuff that we see going on with Saturn and Pisces. Alfred Einhorn introduces Novocaine. I just thought that was interesting for drugs, given the drug stuff that you kind of see with Saturn and Pisces. Now we're in 1906, January 30th, the Ecuadorian Colombian earthquake, 8.8 on the momentum magnitude scale, and associated tsunami caused at least 500 deaths. March 4th, Native American tribal governments are terminated in Indian territory, a prerequisite for creating the U.S. state of Oklahoma in 1907. This was a really big deal. Again, you're seeing this dissolving of borders between the tribal governments and actual states, too. And again, this is the 1900s, a very different world when it came to tribes and states. But again, you kind of see this dissolving of the border. You kind of see this like permeability of it, of like what's the Indian territory versus what is Oklahoma. April 18th, the San Francisco earthquake, estimated magnitude 7.8 on the San Andreas Fault, destroys much of San Francisco, California, killing at least 3,000, with 225,000 to 300,000 left homeless and 350 million done in damages. So this is a really big deal. Again, Northridge earthquake, San Francisco earthquake, two of the biggest earthquakes in California's history happened with Saturn and Pisces. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw the biggest one, another big one on history happen again. Xerox, the global digital office machine brand, is founded in Rochester, New York as the Haloid Photographic Company. Just thought that was interesting. I didn't know Xerox was that old. July 6th, the Second Geneva Convention meets, which I will click on this real quick and let me show you something. Let me do this real quick. So the reason why I thought this was interesting is let's look at what the Second Geneva Convention was, which the Geneva Conventions have been really big for like the war stuff. But this is what was really interesting to me. Oh, can I just do this so you can see it? The Second Geneva Convention for the amelioration of the condition of wounded, sick, and shipwrecked members of armed forces at sea is one of the 4 treaties of the Geneva Convention. So I thought this was just very Saturn and Pisces because it's talking about shipwrecked members and the sea. So interesting for what's it called? Saturn and Pisces. August 23rd, unable to control rebellion, Cuban President Tomas Estrada Paloma requests United States intervention. This leads to the second occupation of Cuba, which lasts till 1909. So again, more Cuba stuff that you see coming up. November 3rd, SOS becomes an international distress signal. I have no idea. I can't really think of anything of why that's Saturn and Pisces. I just thought that was interesting. December 22nd, the magnitude 7.9, 1906 Manasai earthquake in Xinjiang, China, kills nearly 300 people. So again, big earthquakes. So these were just 2 things that happened in 1906. No date for them. Is the BCG vaccine for tuberculosis is first developed. Richard Oldham argues that the Earth has a molten interior, which is really interesting in terms of, I mean, right now there's a big debate of Earth and how it all came to be the way that it is. 1907, Reclamation Service within the Department of the Interior. Let's look at that real quick, because what's so interesting about this is this has everything to do with water. Sorry, I'm moving some stuff around here so you can see this. The Bureau of Reclamation and formerly the United States Reclamation Service is a federal agency under the U.S. Department of the Interior, which oversees water resource management, specifically as it applies to the oversight and operations of diversion, delivery, and storage projects that it has built throughout the Western United States for irrigation, water supply, and the attended hydroelectric power generation. So interesting, right? We see a little bit more of this water stuff coming in with Saturn and Pisces. Also during the 1900s, this is when good old Teddy Roosevelt was president, and he was busy making national forests. The Inyo National Forest, which is great if you've never been. The Chugog, I don't know how to say that, National Forest is established. Never been there. I'm sure it's great. But I thought that was interesting. August 28th, UPS is founded by James Casey in Seattle, Washington. I had no idea UPS was that old, but I think it's interesting that we'll see a Saturn return of both Amazon and UPS during this time. October 22nd, 1907, Panic of 1907. A bank run forces New York's Knickerbocker Trust Company to suspend operations. So this is a really big deal because we talked about a bank run one of the last times Pluto was in Aquarius. And I can imagine the financial system having a really big change over these next 3 years. I mean, that's something like CBDCs, bank runs, banks collapsing, something you're going to see. But then it gets even more interesting. October 24th, 2 days after this bank run, a major American financial crisis is averted when J.P. Morgan, E.H. Harriman, James Stillman, Henry Clay Frick, and other Wall Street financiers create a $25 million pool to invest in the shares of the plunging New York Stock Exchange, ending the bank panic of 1907, a move which ultimately leads to the establishment of the Federal Reserve System. So now we're talking about, I didn't look up I needed to look up the Federal Reserve and when that was created, and when that was created, and if it has Saturn in Pisces or Aries or something like that, or Saturn in Taurus, which would maybe make a little bit more sense. But I thought that was really interesting. Here's where it gets really fucked up. When I mentioned Indiana earlier, Indiana becomes the world's first legislator to place laws permitting compulsory sterilization for eugenic purposes on the statute book. Whoa, I had no idea that even happened here. I knew eugenics was, popular with a bunch of people all around the world, but I didn't know that. I mean, this is the world's first legislator to place laws on compulsory sterilization. Kind of fucking fucked up. Pretty crazy though. The Great White Fleet voyage of 1907 through 1909. Again, these don't have dates on them. But also this was the progressive era. Back then, progressive meant something completely different. But I wanted to show you the Great White Fleet. Tell me if this is Saturn and Pisces or not. Hold on, I'm getting my windows all up. The Great White Fleet. The Great White Fleet was the popular nickname for the group of the United States Navy battleships, which completed a journey around the globe from December 16, 1907 to February 22, 1909 by order of President Theodore Roosevelt. Its mission was to make friendly courtesy visits to numerous countries while displaying new U.S. naval power to the world. This is what I thought was the most funny. Its mission was to make friendly courtesy visits to numerous countries while displaying the U.S. naval power. So Saturn and Pisces are being like, hey, we're just here with our big Navy gunboats, and we're just saying hi. Very like Pisces being like friendly and stuff like that, but Saturn, ships. I just thought that was funny. And again, let me know what all of your guys' opinions about all this stuff below is. Then we get to 1908. This is as Saturn is leaving Pisces and about to go into Aries. February 18th, Japanese immigration to the United States is forbidden under terms of the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907. I love that term, the Gentleman's Agreement. But here we go, immigration. And these are the only two things. But immigration, you see this come up again. Japanese immigration to the United States is forbidden. And then by March 23rd, American diplomat Durham Stevens, an employee of Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is assassinated in San Francisco by two Korean immigrants, unhappy with his recent support for the increasing Japanese presence in Korea. So you get all this Japan-Korea stuff coming up along with immigration. So again, really interesting. So now we're going to 1935. Big shift with what we're talking about here. 1935, a lot of Nazi Germany stuff is what we're going to be talking about. And this was all leading up to World War II, which was like Saturn-Pluto stuff still. So it's not as the same. And also, again, what's important about the 1900s is that was, again, we just talked about 1905, 1906, 1907. That was Saturn in Pisces, Jupiter in Taurus. 1935 through 37 is not that. It's just Saturn in Pisces. But I brought this stuff up anyway, because you'll see a few similarities. I'm going to bring up some Nazi stuff, which is a whole different thing. In terms of like, I wonder what Germany kind of goes through, because Germany has a lot of stuff going on right now. But again, there's not a lot of Saturn and Pisces stuff I can necessarily specifically relate to Nazis or Nazi Germany. But it's just important for context. So I put it here. Anyway, February 26, 1935, in Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler orders reinstatement of the Air Force, the Luftwaffe, in violation of the 1919 Treaties of Versailles. Again, I'm going to botch all of these words. Robert Watson Watt first demonstrates the use of radar to detect aircraft in Daventry in the UK. I only thought this was interesting. I looked a little bit more into this. Radar was already invented by this time, but the fact that they used it to detect aircraft, and you kind of see a lot of that coming up right now with the UFO stuff that they're talking about. So we'll see if anything more with radar comes into contention. March 16th, Adolf Hitler announces German rearmament in violation of the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. Wouldn't be surprised if Germany started getting more guns or something like that, given what's going to be going on here in Europe here soon. March 19th, Harlem riot of 1935. A race riot breaks out in Harlem, New York City, after a rumor circulates that a teenage Puerto Rican shoplifter in the S.H. Kress & Co. department store has been brutally beaten. And again, this is America. Like, we're always seeing race riots, but I did think it was interesting that we talked about the Selma, Alabama thing, and now the Harlem race riot. But also the race stuff is much more Saturn and Aquarius, historically speaking. Here we get with the weather stuff, though. April 14th, the Dust Bowl. Black Sunday, the great dust storm in the United States, hits eastern New Mexico and Colorado and western Oklahoma. The hardest it will be made famous by Woody Guthrie in his Dust Bowl ballads. So again, you see these weather extremes happening. April 17th, Sun Myung Moon, a teenage Presbyterian convert in Korea under Japanese rule, claims to have a revelation from Jesus, telling him to complete his mission from almost 2,000 years ago. So again, you get some more Jesus stuff going on here. May 21st, in Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler announces the reintroduction of conscription to the Wehrmacht in violation of the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. May 31st, 1935, the Quetta earthquake, a 7.1 magnitude earthquake, destroys Quetta in modern-day Pakistan, killing 40,000 people. That was crazy. That's a big number. Here's some more Saturn and Pisces stuff for you. June 10th, Alcoholics Anonymous is founded by Akron, Ohio, United States, by William G. Wilson. So what I love about this is you're talking about the alcohol stuff with Pisces, the sobriety with Saturn, but the anonymous part of it is so Pisces, like just hidden, not wanting to be, like, it's very obfuscated. And I mean, AA has been a really big deal. Like half of my family members are in fucking AA. So I thought that was really interesting. August 14th, United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt signs the Social Security Act into law. So here we go. 1935, Social Security. 1965, Medicare and Medicaid is expanding Social Security. And here we go with 2023 through 2025 and a little bit of 2026. You're going to see some changes in Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. It's just the Saturn return of it. So I kind of doubt it'll be expansion, just given where we're at with debt and everything else. It would be, in my opinion, what this will be is, here's my real opinion. The introduction of a UBI and a central bank digital currency will first come through Social Security first, which would make more sense. But that's my opinion. So we'll see that happen. September 2nd, 1935, Labor Day hurricane, the strongest hurricane ever to strike the United States, landfalls in the upper Florida Keys as a Category 5 storm with 185-mile-an-hour winds, killing 423. So again, you see these more weather extremes. September 15th, the Nuremberg laws go into effect in Germany, removing citizenship from Jews. Boo. 1936. So we're still in Saturn and Pisces. April 5th, a tornado hits Tupelo, Mississippi, killing 216 people and injuring over 700, the fourth deadliest tornado in U.S. history. April 15th, the Tulkarm shooting begins the 1936 to 1939 Arab revolt in Palestine against the British government in opposition to Jewish immigration. So it seems as if the Jews can't ever get a break when it comes to history. So, I mean, me saying that something might happen to the Jews during Saturn Pisces is like the sun will rise again. But we'll see. Just kind of curious about that part of it. My curiosity got a little bit more struck with the Palestine part of it, and Israel, Palestine, you guys know all that. June 26th, the Focke-Wulf FW-61, the first fully controllable helicopter, makes its maiden flight. So we saw the SR-71 Blackbird in the 60s, and now we're seeing the first helicopter, which we have more to talk about with aviation, happens with Saturn and Pisces. This is so Saturn and Pisces. Are you guys ready for this one? July 4th, first publication recognizing stress as a biological condition. That's so Saturn and Pisces of like, I am stressed and it's not good for your health. September 13th, in response to a polio outbreak, Chicago Public Schools launches a distance education program, which constitutes the first large-scale use of radio broadcast to facilitate distance education. I thought distance learning was a thing in 2020. I did not know that it has happened before. I didn't know that there was any sort of precedent for it. And I kind of don't know what to make of this. To be honest with you, I was just kind of blown away that, for one, it had happened before. And also, God, I mean, Zoom class sounds horrible. Imagine taking school over radio. Fuck. But I thought this was really interesting that this distance learning thing was done before. And we're talking about the radio, just like we saw the Boss radio thing change in the 60s. Now we're seeing the use of the radio here. And the radio is way more important in the 30s too. So interesting. October, Joseph Stalin's Great Purge begins in Soviet Union. Boo, communism. So we don't like that. December 7th, streptococcus meningitis, a condition previously 99% fatal, is successfully treated for the first time with sulfonamide. interesting. I only thought this was interesting just because I just watched Fun with Dick and Jay not that long ago, and he says Streptococcus meningitis, and I thought it was a fake, made-up disease. But I'm dumb. So, West China famine, an estimated 5 million people die. Sorry that I laughed. It's just when it comes to anything with China, like anything around the world, it's like a few thousand died or a few hundred died. With China, it's always in the millions. It's kind of like a joke in like history. Like I see a lot of history memes in my Instagram, and it's always millions of people. But also with Pluto and Aquarius, in my last video I did with the history of Pluto and Aquarius, a lot of famines in China happen. So West China famine, an estimated 5 million people die. Now we're in 1937. Water levels begin to rise in the Ohio River in the United States, leading to the Ohio River flood of 1937, which continues into February, leaving 1 million people homeless and 385 people dead. I'm so glad I got an opportunity to re-record this podcast because the last time I recorded this was before the train wreck in Ohio, which now the question is it going to go into the Ohio River? What will that do? And you see this huge thing with the Ohio River happen. I mean, leaving 1 million people homeless and 385 people dead is really big for 1937 in Ohio. And it's just interesting that we're seeing more shit with Ohio, specifically also the Ohio River, given the contamination of everything. Of course, it's the air and everything else, but I thought that was interesting. February 16th, Wallace H. Carothers receives a patent for nylon in the United States, so interesting synthetic material. March 18th, New London School explosion and the worst school disaster in American history in terms of lives lost. The New London School in New London, Texas suffers a catastrophic natural gas explosion, super Saturn and Pisces, killing in excess of 295 students and teachers. Mother Frances Hospital opens in Tyler, Texas, a day ahead of schedule in response to the explosion. Here we go with the plane stuff again. April 12th, Frank Whittle ground tests the world's first jet engine designed to power an aircraft at Rugby, England. So here we go with jets being involved, right? We had the helicopter, the jet, then the SR-71 Blackbird. And then you also had the space race during that time. So just have a lot of like jet innovations with Saturn and Pisces. Again, a lot of science and tech, which I thought was interesting. May 6th. Okay. So this was not Saturn and Pisces. This was right when Saturn went into Aries, because in 1937, Saturn dipped into Aries and went back into Pisces. And so technically this was Saturn and Aries, which as an astrologer, I'm like, oh, this is so much more Saturn and Pisces. But anyway, May 6th, the Hindenburg disaster. In the United States, the German airship, the Hindenburg, burst into flames when the mooring to a mast in Lakehurst, New Jersey. Of the 36 passengers and 61 crew on board, 13 passengers and 22 crew die, as well as one member of the ground crew. So Hindenburg disaster, it sounds very Saturn and Pisces. It's not, but whatever. November 9th, the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japanese troops take Shanghai. December 1st, the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Battle of Nanking begins. All really big deals with Japan and China. Which again, if China invades Taiwan, that will bring in, that's just going to totally change just the Asian countries in general. December 11th, Italy withdraws from the League of Nations, which is a really big deal in terms of, them invoking fascism and all that stuff. December 21st, Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the world's first feature-length animated film, premieres in the Carthy Circle in Los Angeles. So here we go with more of the Disney stuff. Like, I'm so curious because I don't really, all I hear about Disney nowadays is just Ron DeSantis in Florida and the woke shit. So I don't really know if they're planning on like an AI generated like film or what's going on with that, but I would be really interested to see what's going on with Disney and what big movies they come out with soon. And okay, this next one is Saturn and Aries. For when I first wrote this down, I was like, that's so Saturn and Pisces, but then I thought more about it and it's Saturn and Aries. But Italian psychiatrist Amaro Fiamberti is the first to document transorbital approach to the brain, which becomes the basis for the controversial medical procedure of transorbital lobotomy. So I was like, oh, that's so Saturn and Pisces because it just turns your brain off. But then I thought more about it. I was like, that's Saturn and Aries because you just like bop your face, bop your head, and then boom, you've been lobotomized. But that's pretty much everything that I found that I thought was at least interesting enough to bring to your attention. Again, I want to know what you guys think. Something else too, I actually meant to say this in the beginning. Something I love about the astrology community is so many of you guys are, well, at least specifically my following, are experts in so many different fields and areas of life. And I would want to know, what do you guys know about this time period? Is there anything that you can relate to? Saturn and Pisces or anything like that. What are your opinions on everything going on below? And yeah, I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you want to support me, please like this video. It helps. Please comment. Let me know your opinions, even if it's just to boost the algorithm. It totally helps. Subscribe to my channel. I know a lot of you watch me and don't subscribe. Subscribe. It helps me. Same thing too on my Patreon. If you want to support me, I have Ask Me Anything live streams. I do monthly horoscopes. I do monthly overview live streams where you get to chat with me. Exclusive content. I have a Discord as well. If you want to support me on there, or if you want to do a consultation, I'm still open for consultations. It's my favorite thing to do in astrology. Please consider booking a consultation with me. Go to my website, camwhiteastro.com. And with that being said, I'll leave you off with that. I love and appreciate every single one of you, and I'll be seeing you next time.